Perfect. The first thing I would like to start with is a presentation on a general presentation on ELNs and why we believe that they should be used in everyday scientific research and in general as part of the data management process, which should be part of every more or less R&D lab or research lab, etc. So to begin with, a quick definition of what a notebook, a laboratory notebook should be is more or less is the main means for recording research. Whether that's, I don't know, physics, chemistry, material science, whatever, we need a lab book, so a notebook so that we can record what we do on our everyday practice, experimental practice in the lab. So what we do with that is more or less we document the hypothesis that we form so as to perform an experiment and the test. We write down the experimental procedure, how we want to perform the experiment, what methods and protocols we will use, and then the settings that we use or the settings that we use to perform the experiment, and then some observations, let's say what deviations were needed so as to make an experiment successful, or what needed so as to get a good image and so on. And then an initial analysis or interpretation. In some cases, let's say on my case, I used to more or less take, let's say, screenshots or print stuff like graphs to put them into the yes, of course, you can get a copy of the slides in the more or less in the notebook, so as to remember, let's say, a grading or something like that, or let's say how my slope looked before I go into the analysis of the results, etc., like a proper analysis of the results. Also, it's very interesting, a laboratory notebook can also act as, let's say, a legal document with which you can protect intellectual property and so on, used, let's say, for patenting purposes, etc. But so far, let's say the traditional way of doing things is more or less that everyone had a series of paper notebooks in which they wrote everything and they input everything, which, as we can understand, is just very environmental friendly. And also that also meant that it took a long time to record things. When let's say when you needed to write something, or when you're observing something, or when you needed to let's say to print out something, put it in, etc. That also means that the cost in terms of working hours and consumables goes higher. You need a huge storage space, especially if you're a big group and then you need to store the notebooks of all the people that have been in your group, etc. Then you need a huge library to put everything in and keep track and of everything in there. In general and realistically, it's not really easy to back up. So more or less, let's say someone would also more or less need to take, let's say, photocopies or scan the notebooks, etc. And that would take a really long time to do. It cannot be easily searched. So let's say if someone asked you what you did in an experiment, let's say 3 years ago, then you would need to actually go and find through the notebooks which one was it, then go through the page, etc. In many cases, especially taking into account my bad handwriting, I even have trouble deciphering what my handwriting looks like and getting back information of what I wrote. So I cannot imagine, let's say, how it can be if I had to do it for a person similar to me, that I would have to read their handwriting. And in practice, it's very hard to more or less share paper notebooks between people of a specific group, because you may take let's say the notebook at your place to note something, then let's say you get ill, you don't go in, so the person that had to take over the experiment could not take the actual handbook, and then that meant that more or less he would need to they would need to write down things on a separate document and then transfer into the new document, etc. And of course, if you take all of these things together, then there's a huge problem adding up to the reproducibility crisis. And to more or less point at that. So think of, let's say, of a case study that you join a group and your PI or your head of R&D or whatever asks you to reproduce an experiment that was performed 5 years ago. And imagine that there were a lot of people that have joined this group, let's say, during these 5 years. So what you would need to do is you would need to go identify the correct lab book. You would need to identify the correct experiment and where that was it. Then understand what someone else wrote, whatever the, let's say, the writing, and then understand everything in the process, understand the settings, etc. And keep in mind that usually when you have such things, let's say, even if it's published, you don't have the full details offered to you within a published paper. And then you would need also to retrieve the original raw data that were produced during that experiment. And assuming you find the data, that you know where to find the data and so on, you need actually to make sense of it. And then you will need to do the experiment and hope that the data that you will produce will match or will be not match, will be actually within experimental error of the original experiment. So that's a pretty tricky process in general. So imagine that you have something like an experiment that looks like that, like this, in which you have a lot of different experimental steps. So a blue should be considered as an experimental step with different things to take into account and to measure. So to characterize, let's say, your nanoparticles, your nanomaterials, the medium, and so on. And you would have to do all these things so as to be able to reproduce this experiment. And think of doing this like 5 years later. That's going to be a very challenging process to do so. What we believe in NanoCommons and what we believe should happen, let's say, bringing, let's say, all the research groups, whether experimental or computational, is that there's a need of implementation of electronic laboratory notebooks. In practice, what this is that they are cloud-based software which can be used so as to perform all the functions that that a group requires, more or less: data sharing, data collaboration, understanding the protocols, sharing the protocols, documenting deviation, and so on, uploading the raw data, doing some preliminary data analysis, and so on. Let's say import images, annotating your data, so as to have a full log of what the group does, of what each member of the group does, what takes place in experiments that more than 1 or 2 persons are involved, etc. And all this, more or less, needs to be searchable. So let's say that you can go easily in, and 5 years later, you can actually go into a search engine, type in some keywords, and then find the details that you need a lot quicker and a lot easier than having to go through a library, a physical library full of different notebooks from different people. And of course, let's say other functions that are very helpful is, let's say, automatic report creation, so that, let's say, you can share what you did with other people. Let's say if you were working within a project with multiple partners, and APIs for linking notebooks, the electronic notebooks, with knowledge bases, so that you can transfer your data directly into a knowledge base, so that you can store your data into the relevant database that match your data, etc. More or less, by implementing something like that, you get a lot of benefits. I will also emphasize this during the presentation and in the end. Keep in mind that this is not a complete solution. It's part of the data management project. And not only the data management, but also the project management process. More or less, with an ELN, what you can do is you can manage the experimental part of a project in a streamlined way. Think of it, let's say, like a project management software for an experiment. It can be host it locally or in the cloud. So more or less, you can have it between a firewall within your institution if you have sensitive data, and then so no one else but within your institution and within your group can access it. Or you can have it, let's say, open, cloud-based, so that different people from different places around the world can access it if needed. It's easy to set up complex experiments compared to traditional lab books, although we need to keep in mind that usually in the beginning, when you start building something like that, it's going to take a substantial amount of workload to set it up for an entire team. But in the long run, in the mid to long run, that would mean that you would save a lot more time than not having something like that. You can have a protocol repository where you can store all your protocols in their original form that cannot be edited by anyone, so that it cannot be lost, and then you can actually use this protocol within specific experimental procedures and note any deviations within the experiment and so on. And then you can record data as you produce them. You digitize the data as you do so directly, because it's already, let's say, in the cloud. You can include, let's say, QA and QC processes, and most importantly, everyone, let's say, in the group or every partner in the project, all the ones that are supposed to, can actually access the data in real time. The barriers now for the integration of electronic lab notebooks in everyday experimental practice. The main one, I would say, is established habits. So people like me are, let's say, persons of habit. So when we're using something and we know something works, we're very reluctant so as to change it. The other one is the lack of time. So more or less, as I said, it takes a long time to actually set it up in a proper way and make it fully functional within an organization. And this actually needs to be done. A lack of data management literacy, more or less people, there's a lack of training when it comes to data management processes in everyday scientific practice coming into the 21st century, and how this should be done properly so as to have, let's say, your data fully documented, your metadata fully documented, and actually follow the requirements of the fair data principles that are a very hot topic right now. And there's a lot of mistrust in cloud-based and digital tools when it comes to security, and this is understandable. But there are a lot of high security measures now from companies actually developing these notebooks and offering to the public. And as I said, you can always have, let's say, a local instance in most cases, so as people outside your organization cannot access the ELN, which will make it a lot safer. And of course, there are training requirements. So you always need to have people using the tool, knowing the tool, that will train the new members so that they can actually use it accordingly. So what we did in NanoCommons is that we collaborated, and I would like here to comment on Thomas Eckner and his team from 7past9 that provided this opportunity for us. So all this is more or less their work, and very helpful, is that we worked with Synode, which is an open software, an open code software. So you can actually take the Docker and actually install it locally. So Synode is a commercial, of course, ELN, but that has different features available if you go into their website and use the commercial version. But you can actually get the Docker, install it, let's say, in your own server, and have the full working version. So what we will do today is more or less work and demonstrate the functionalities of Synode when you have a local instance of the ELN by actually getting the Docker and installing it, or let's say using it through NanoCommons through the website of 7past9, our partners. And also, if you want to go into and collaborate with Synode, the people that actually developing it, and get their, let's say, premium packages and so on. Which also gives you, let's say, enhanced security continuously. Also, we will give you the updates quicker and so on. So more or less a bit on the structure of Synode. What happens is more or less that you have different teams. You have, let's say, your samples that you can actually put and record and document and monitor. Think of it, let's say, like similar to a LIMS, let's say, but not in the very rigid structure of a LIMS software, which is follow the sample completely. And then you have different experiments that we will see, different projects, and then you have your protocols repository, where you can have all your protocols linked and put together. And then you have your results, where you can actually record your results and your observation as they come in. And also Synode comes with the integration of, let's say, Microsoft Office Online, which also gives you a bit of leeway when it comes to doing, let's say, some summations, or let's say some statistics, so as to make calculations, let's say quick calculations, calculations within Synode as you get your data. Also, you have what it is said as an inventory, where you can actually modify this so as to implement specific, let's say, data templates, which then you can extract and automatically currently ship to a data repository via email or through email and so on for further analysis and exploitation. And this is something that we will see in detail probably in the next hackathon. So now going into, let's say, a quick case study. So let's say that we work locally. So we're going to characterize nanomaterial, and we're going to do that in a way that will not also include, let's say, characterizing it through more or less, let's say, going from instrument to instrument, measuring the size, let's say with TEM, measuring the zeta potential or the hydrodynamic diameter, either with DLS or NTA or whatever. But we also want to do some calculations when it comes to different, let's say, aspects of the nanomaterial, like the energy band gap, etc. So this is the map of the University of Birmingham. So think that, let's say, when we want to characterize a nanomaterial, more or less we have to move from building to building, from laboratory to laboratory, so as to be able to access as many of the instruments as required in its case. And think about, let's say, having to do 5, 6 or all of these instruments so as to fully characterize nanomaterial, then get the data and then analyze the data. So that would mean with a paper notebook, that meant that you would take your paper notebook, you would have to mark everything, you would have to mark the protocol for each instrument, then take it to the instrument, write down everything you do there, note it, get the data with a USB stick or mail the data if it's possible, then go back, analyze the data in your computer, get some screenshots, print out the screenshots, put in a paper notebook, etc. Now, a different approach would be to set up an experimental procedure within, let's say, an ELN, Synode in this instance, where you more or less, the first thing you do, you can actually create a stock solution of your nanomaterial, then do a sample preparation so as to more or less see what the stock solution concentration is, and then let's say run an ICP-MS analysis of your sample. And then you have everything within the ELN. You don't need to carry anything else with you rather than your phone, and you can note everything directly in there, and everything goes directly. The same thing can be done then for other characterization methods, so TM, DLS. Here we assume that the DLS can measure more or less both the hydrodynamic diameter, but also the zeta potential of the nanomaterial. And then you can also do UVVs and get the results more or less for the absorption wavelength, etc. But then what you can do is you can actually create workflows within the sign node so as more or less to do some computational work. So let's say from TM and using, let's say, specific, let's say you take the images, you upload them into sign node, you have somehow measured the size distribution, you can see the morphology, etc. And then you can go directly into the data, let's say into an algorithm, and then calculate the surface area, the geometric surface area based on the morphology, or let's say an estimated specific surface area, etc. and so on, so as to calculate that. Or let's say you can go to your UV-Vis example, your UV-Vis results, and then taking the raw data from the UV-Vis, putting it into sign node, and using the abilities of Microsoft Online, do a tau plot, and then calculate the energy band gap of the material. So instead of doing that separately in different places, let's say having a notebook, go around, do that, maybe you forget something, then you have to go back, as I always did. I would take my notebook, I would forget my USB, I would go back, sometimes I would take the USB and forget the notebook, etc. So that can be a lot quicker to get everything together and more efficiently. And then now think that you're working for, let's say, for an international experiment project, whether that's an Horizon project or whether that's, let's say, a collaboration with other people. And someone, let's say, like you have to do a round-robin experiment, for example, with people from different organizations in different countries all around the world. Take into account the time difference, so as share the protocol, comment on the protocol, do the experiment, share the data, analyze data, and so on. A better way to do that, this is an example more or less done, performed in the ACE Nano project, where we were also partners and so on, was more or less to put everything within into the ELN and have people perform the experiment in their organizations, in their laboratories, but then putting the data into the sign node, where we had implemented, let's say, different approaches like online Excel files, so people put in their data, automatically calculate plots, and from the plot calculate the required data. So more or less this was calculating size using the UV-Vis, and more or less we had 5 known samples and unknown sample, and we used that so as to do a round-robin experiment, so as to calculate the size. And in this way, let's say the leader of the round-robin, in this case the University of Birmingham, was able to monitor the process and was able to test on the data and the deviations from the experimental procedures that were made required in real time. So all communication could place also through sign node, in many cases through the comment sections, etc. So as, let's say, everything was streamlined and more efficient compared to traditional means of communication and data sharing. And now let's go back to, let's say, now again having to do that experiment, but now instead of actually having to go through the lab, a traditional paper notebook, you do that through more or less an electronic lab notebook. Again, you see how big an experiment is, but now things are a lot better, because now more or less you can have all these experimental steps integrated into a laboratory notebook, more or less everything, all the steps that need to be done in the experimental process have their own place within the laboratory notebook. They are searchable, they are in there, they cannot be deleted, which is also a huge benefit of the ELNs, that if you have it in your server and if you have a backup, you cannot actually delete permanently an experiment for data transparency purposes. You can archive experiments, they will go into the archive, but they will be searchable and available to be retrieved at any time. So more or less, you have the different experimental steps here. everything that was done in the experiment, and then within, let's say, an experimental step, you would have all the different steps in the experimental process. And as you can see here, you can create, let's say, connections and dependencies between the different experimental steps. So I create my dispersion, I do my toxicity test. The characterization is in another instance within the experiment, and similarly, and so on. So you know what happened when. As you will see, you can go in, input your protocol. The protocol is there, typed in exactly as it was performed. You can have the settings recorded. You can have notes, let's say, in deviation and so on. So yeah, you can have all the information, and it becomes a lot easier both to follow the logic, what was being done, how it was being done, and to reproduce the experiment. By all means, it's not a perfect solution. I don't know whether we will ever have a perfect solution. It's not a complete data management process, I say again, but it's a good start, more or less, so as to increase the transparency and robustness of our data. And here is again where I say this, more or less, that ELNs, in our opinion, are far better than paper notebooks, more helpful, more convenient, more efficient to use. Again, I will emphasize it's not a complete data management solution, and they actually should be part of the data management ecosystem, which includes knowledge bases, annotation, computational processes, etc., metadata recording, so that everything comes together and gives us a complete solution. And of course, more work is needed so as to integrate all the different parts. Hopefully, let's say, all this to communicate automatically within them using APIs or other communication protocols, so as to create a fully functional working environment. And this is my semi-quick introduction. And thank you very much for listening first. And if there's anything if there are any questions I can answer, now I will be happy to do so.